Okay, so you've owned an entry-level DSLR camera for a while now, you've really gotten to know how to use it and you love it, but you're ready for an upgrade. Two of the best cameras on the market right now are the Sony a7s Mark II and the Panasonic GH5, but the question is, which one should I get? Now, if this is you, then know this. I'm actually in a very similar department and I myself am trying to decide between the two cameras as to which one should be my next camera I'm gonna upgrade to. Just quietly, I've already kind of made my decision, which I'll let you know at the end of the video, but I did want to make a video that discusses the pros and cons of each camera and why you'd want to go with one over the other. So firstly, let's get the similarities out of the way. Both cameras can shoot high quality cinematic 4K internal footage, and if dealt with carefully, then both cameras can actually produce some really gorgeous, fairly comparable frames. This may sound crazy, but I'm not actually going to discuss image quality all that much in this video because A, there's already 1,000 other tests online for you to watch if you're interested in that, and B, the image quality is actually very similar between the two cameras and it's pretty much impossible to pick a winner either way. So next, both cameras have in-body stabilization, which means any lens you currently own, even if it's a manual prime lens, all of a sudden becomes a stabilized lens. There is some debate as to which camera handles stabilization better. The GH5 takes a more aggressive approach, which means you can get some really buttery gimbal-like shots, although in some scenarios you do get some funny side effects as a result. But the a7s II will provide a more natural stabilization without giving you gimbal-like smoothness. After that, both cameras have autofocus, although neither have really knocked it out of the park when comparing it to other cameras on the market, but the a7s II is slightly slower and not as accurate when comparing it to the GH5's autofocusing abilities. Both cameras are also incredibly easy to adapt lenses to, meaning you don't need to go and throw out your Canon or your Nikon glass just yet, because you can buy really inexpensive adapters for both cameras, which means you can continue to use your beloved glass. Moving on to some key differences. Both cameras can shoot at 120 frames per second when shooting at 1080p, but the GH5 can go all the way up to 180 frames per second at 1080p. The a7s II also crops in 2.2 times when shooting at 120 frames per second, which may be a good thing or a bad thing depending on your tastes, but the GH5 can also shoot at 60 frames per second at 4K, whereas the Sony a7s II can only shoot at 30 frames per second at 4K. If slow motion is a high priority for you, then the GH5 is definitely a winner here in this category. Next, we take a look at the different sensor sizes. The a7s II has a full frame sensor, whereas the GH5 has a micro four thirds sensor, which is effectively a 2x crop of a full frame sensor. In reality, for me, this will affect three things fairly significantly. First, the field of view. Obviously being a 2x crop, this makes it incredibly hard to get wide angle shots on a micro four thirds camera. For example, to achieve the same field of view you get using a 35mm lens on a full frame camera will require that you use an 18mm lens on a micro four thirds camera. 35mm really isn't considered to be that wide, even on a full frame sensor, and so it's near impossible to get a wide field of view using a micro four thirds camera, whereas it's fairly easy using a full frame camera. Secondly, low light performance. Being smaller, it means that not as much light is let into the sensor, which can have an impact on the low light performance of a camera. And that certainly is the case with the GH5 versus the a7s II. With the GH5, you really can't use the footage when you go over an ISO of 3200, whereas with the a7s Mark II, you can still have pretty good quality images at an ISO of 20,000. It's not completely 100% related to the sensor in and of itself. Sony's done some other wizardry to make it as crazy a low light performer as it is, but it certainly does play a part. The a7s Mark II can pretty much see in the dark. It's definitely not a feature to gloss over, and the low light capabilities are one of the biggest selling points, or one of the biggest reasons people buy the a7s Mark II. The third way is the depth of field. Having a full frame sensor such as the a7s Mark II means achieving that shallow depth of field is a lot easier. For example, shooting at f4 on the Sony a7s Mark II will provide for some great depth and beautiful bokeh, whereas to achieve that same look on a GH5, you'll have to shoot with a lens at f2. This means that to have some really beautiful blurry depth of field images from the GH5, it's going to require that you have a bunch of fast lenses, and even then, it's not really going to be comparable to the Sony a7s II equivalent. So for cinematographers looking to achieve that film look with that super shallow depth of field, then you'll definitely want to go for the a7s Mark II. Also, if you shoot indoors a lot and feel limited by the amount of space you have, then that wider field of view that you get using the full frame sensor on the Sony a7s II is going to help you out a lot. On the other hand, some shooters may prefer to have less of a shallow depth of field, particularly if you want a lot of your image in focus, and if that's you, then the GH5 is definitely worth considering. As well as that, lens options may weigh in on your decision as well. Like I said earlier, both cameras are able to adapt lenses really easily, but you actually have more options, particularly in the lower budget range for the GH5. There are actually a whole range of lenses such as the ever popular Sigma 835 f1.8 art lens, which are made only for crop censored cameras such as the GH5. If you attempt to use these lenses on a full frame camera, you'll actually introduce a significant amount of vignetting around the image. In addition, crop censored lenses tend to be a little bit cheaper as well, particularly if you're looking for ones that have autofocus features and so on. If though you're someone happy using manual prime lenses, then there's not actually a significant price difference between the two cameras. So keep that in mind. If most of the budget is reserved for the camera with little left over for lenses, then the GH5 might be a better pick. The next feature to keep in mind are the camera's articulating screens. The a7s Mark II has a tiltable screen which is limited to just that. You can only tilt up and down, it can't swivel out, which means you can't see yourself if you're someone who films yourself in front of the camera. The GH5 on the other hand does have a fully articulating screen, so you can flip that bad boy out as much as you want so you can see yourself when filming. And so if all the money is going towards the camera again, and you don't have an external monitor already, and you require to film yourself from time to time, then the GH5 is definitely the winner here. If though you're going to be primarily behind the camera, or you already own an external monitor, or you have the budget to buy one, then the screen on the a7s won't be much of a factor here. Battery life for this one goes hands down to the GH5, which does last a fair bit longer than the Sony a7s Mark II. And so if you're going out on long shoots and you don't want external batteries to be part of your rig, then I'd definitely say go for the GH5. And finally, pricing. The body of the GH5 comes in at around $2,000 US, whereas the Sony a7s II comes in at around $2,600 US. If though you're looking to improve the low light performance of the GH5 with a speed booster, for example, then the prices actually become fairly similar between the two cameras. In saying that, I think the GH5 is more equipped right out of the box with that swiveling screen and the better battery life, meaning you don't need as much external equipment to make it a fully fledged setup, so that's definitely something to keep in mind. At the end of the day, the price difference is actually fairly small in the grander scheme of things, and so ultimately it comes down to preference and what you need. For me, I've decided that the full frame sensor of the a7s II is the biggest difference between the two cameras. I've been using a crop censored camera for roughly 3 years now, and so I don't just want a jump in resolution for the price that I'm going to be paying. Rather, I want extra options when it comes to creativity, and I believe that that is what I will get from purchasing the Sony a7s Mark II. In saying that, the Panasonic GH5 is an absolutely phenomenal camera, and it made this decision really hard because of how damn good it is. If the a7s wasn't full frame, I would definitely go for the GH5. But what are your thoughts? Do you agree with my decision, or do you think I'm making a fatal error? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. But that's it. Hopefully you found this helpful in making your own camera purchasing decision. And if you're interested, I will include some links to some video tests and other articles in the notes below. Anyway, that's it. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I will catch you later.